The morning mist clung to the Ashford estate like a shroud, winding through the overgrown rose garden with fingers of grey that obscured the fading blooms and tangled stems. Eleanor Ashford knelt among the dying flowers, her dress already damp at the hem, her hands gentle as they pruned away the dead growth her mother would never have allowed to accumulate. 10 years. 10 years since the fever had taken Lady Catherine Ashford, and with her, any reason for the household to notice its second daughter. Eleanor worked methodically, her movements practiced and solitary, finding in this neglected garden the only place where her presence felt like something other than an intrusion. The roses had been her mother's joy, planted and tended with a devotion that Eleanor now continued alone, though no one remarked upon her efforts or admired the stubborn blooms she coaxed from reluctant stems. She could hear the household stirring behind the manor's windows, the clatter of breakfast being laid, and she knew without looking at the angle of the weak October sun that she was late, that they would already be seated, that her absence would go unnoticed until her presence became inconvenient. Rising with the stiffness of cold and kneeling, she brushed the soil from her hands and made her way through the garden gate, past the manicured hedges that someone else maintained, toward the servants' entrance she had learned to use, to avoid tracking dirt through halls where her sister Vivienne might see and offer that particular smile of disdain wrapped in pity. The breakfast room was warm and bright when she slipped into her chair at the table's far end, the smallest chair with the least favourable position, tucked nearly into the corner where the morning light did not reach. Her father, Lord Ashford, sat at the head in robust conversation with Vivienne, whose golden hair caught the sun like a crown, whose laugh rang through the room like music, whose every gesture commanded attention that came as naturally as breathing. "The Hartwell ball was a triumph, father," Vivienne was saying, her voice animated with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own significance. "Lady Hartwell remarked upon my gown at least 3 times, and Lord Pemberton requested 2 dances, which you know is quite—" Eleanor reached for the toast, her movements small and quiet, practiced in the art of taking up no space. A servant filled her tea without meeting her eyes, a kindness Eleanor had learned to interpret as mercy rather than slight, for to be invisible to the servants meant they at least did not join in the family's determined erasure of her existence. "Eleanor, you've brought dirt to the table," her father said without looking at her, his tone carrying the weary disappointment of a man forced to acknowledge an inconvenience. She looked down at her hands, scrubbed but still bearing the faint crescents of soil beneath her nails, evidence of the morning's work in the garden no one visited. "I apologize, father. I was tending mother's roses." The words fell into silence, heavy and unwelcome. Vivienne's expression flickered with something Eleanor could no longer name. Was it pain or merely irritation at the mention of the woman whose love had once been divided between 2 daughters, instead of concentrated entirely upon one? "Those roses should be torn out," Lord Ashford said, returning his attention to his plate. "Waste of good land. Vivienne, you were saying about Lord Pemberton?" And just like that, Eleanor dissolved back into invisibility, a ghost at her own family's table, forgotten as thoroughly as if she had never spoken at all. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered on cream paper with the Duke of Silverton's seal pressed into black wax, and with it the household transformed into something Eleanor barely recognized, a churning hive of ambition and preparation that left no corner untouched by its fevered energy. She learned of the contents not from her father, who did not think to inform her directly, but from the raised voices that carried through the manor's halls as Lord Ashford consulted with Vivienne behind the closed doors of his study, their excitement palpable even through oak and stone. The Duke of Silverton, widowed these 2 years past, wealthy beyond measure, connected to half the great families of England, would be visiting the Ashford estate within a fortnight to consider prospects for remarriage, and Lord Ashford had apparently impressed upon his Grace the exceptional qualities of his eldest daughter during their brief encounter at the season's opening ball. Eleanor heard the news and felt the old familiar weight settle upon her shoulders, the knowledge of what her role would be in this latest performance of her family's aspirations. She had stood in this position before, 6 times over the past decade, each time for a different gentleman of quality who came to see Vivienne shine. Eleanor was to be the shadow that made the light more brilliant, the plain setting that made the jewel more precious, the forgotten sister whose very ordinariness would render Vivienne's beauty and accomplishment all the more extraordinary by contrast. The house erupted into motion that very afternoon. Dressmakers summoned from London, menus planned and replanned, chambers aired and furnished and decorated with an attention to detail that spoke of desperation wrapped in pride. Vivienne held court in the drawing room, draped across the settee like a painting of indolence and grace, calling out commands to servants who rushed to fulfill her every whim, while she debated the merits of the blue silk versus the emerald green, the pearl combs versus the diamond pins. Lord Ashford spared no expense, his investment in his daughter's future as calculating as any business venture, though he clothed it in paternal devotion that might have been convincing to anyone who had not watched him ignore his other daughter for 10 years. Eleanor's instructions came second-hand, delivered by the housekeeper with apologetic eyes. She was to ensure the manor was presentable, arrange flowers in all the common rooms, review the library for any volumes that might interest a ducal guest, and above all, make herself useful but unobtrusive during the Duke's visit. She was to attend dinners, providing numbers for the table, but speak only when addressed. She was to wear her simplest gowns, style her hair without ornament, become the blank canvas against which Vivienne's portrait would be painted. Eleanor had nodded, accepting these directives as she had accepted all the others, and retreated to her small room under the eaves where she allowed herself, for just one moment, to feel the full weight of her perpetual erasure. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap, and permitted a single tear to trace its way down her cheek before she wiped it away with steady fingers and rose to begin her preparations. That evening, while Vivienne dined on delicacies prepared to test recipes for the Duke's visit, Eleanor worked alone in the drawing room with armfuls of late roses from her mother's garden, arranging them in vases with care no one would attribute to her, creating beauty that would be admired without anyone thinking to wonder whose hands had coaxed it into being. The Duke of Silverton arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the October sky hung low and grey above the Ashford estate, in his carriage, magnificent and imposing, as it rolled up the carefully swept drive that Eleanor had spent the previous day ensuring was free of fallen leaves and debris. She watched his arrival from the music-room window on the second floor, her assigned position well away from the formal greeting that would take place at the entrance, where her father and Vivienne stood in their finest attire, faces arranged in expressions of welcome that balanced dignity with eagerness in precisely calibrated measure. From her distant vantage point, Eleanor could observe the Duke as he emerged from his carriage, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the natural authority of a man born to command respect, his dark hair touched with grey at the temples, though he could not be more than 35. He was handsome in the stark way of classical sculpture, all clean lines and aristocratic bearing, but even from this distance Eleanor could perceive something else in the set of his shoulders, a heaviness that spoke of burdens carried in silence, a melancholy that clung to him as surely as the mist clung to her mother's roses each morning. Duke Adrian Rothwell, she knew from the whispered conversations of servants who forgot she was present, had lost his wife to childbed fever 2 years past, the babe following its mother within hours, and had retreated from society into a grief that had only recently begun to thaw enough to contemplate the necessity of remarriage and the production of an heir. Eleanor felt an unexpected kinship with this stranger's sorrow, recognized in his careful movements the same protective reserve she had cultivated in herself, the armor of composure worn by those who had learned that revealing pain only invited its exploitation. The formal dinner that evening was an exercise in exquisite torture, every element choreographed to showcase Vivienne's accomplishments, while relegating Eleanor to her role as living shadow at the table's far end. The dining room blazed with candlelight that turned Vivienne's golden hair to spun sunlight and left Eleanor's brown locks dull by comparison, and the conversation flowed around topics carefully selected to allow Vivienne to display her wit, her musical talents, her knowledge of literature and current affairs that came from expensive tutors rather than the solitary reading that was Eleanor's only education. Duke Adrian sat at her father's right hand, responding to Vivienne's animated discourse with polite attention that Eleanor, watching from her peripheral position, recognized as the performance of interest rather than its genuine article. She had become expert, after all, in distinguishing between true engagement and mere courtesy, having received so little of the former and so much of the latter throughout her invisible decade. She had been served and had eaten mechanically, her presence acknowledged only by the footman who filled her wineglass, when her napkin slipped from her lap and fell to the floor beside her chair. A small incident that should have been beneath notice, certainly beneath the attention of a duke. But Adrian had seen it fall, and before Eleanor could retrieve it herself or signal a servant, he had risen from his seat and crossed the length of the dining room to where she sat frozen in surprise, bending to collect the fallen linen and extending it to her with a slight bow that brought his eyes level with hers for the first time. In that moment of unexpected contact, Eleanor felt something shift in the careful architecture of her defenses, for the Duke's eyes, grey as morning mist, storm clouds, winter seas, looked at her with a quality of attention she had almost forgotten existed, a seeing that went beyond mere acknowledgement of her physical presence to recognition of something deeper, as though he perceived in her face some truth that others had trained themselves to overlook. The moment lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, perhaps an eternity, before Eleanor remembered herself and murmured her thanks, taking the napkin with trembling fingers, while her father's voice cut across the room with forced joviality, calling the Duke back to his proper place, back to Vivienne's performance, back to the script from which this brief exchange had been an unexpected deviation. But as Adrian returned to his seat and the dinner resumed its planned course, Eleanor sat very still and felt the dangerous stirring of something she had promised herself she would never feel again, the terrible, fragile beginning of hope. Eleanor woke the morning after the dinner, with her heart still unsettled by the brief moment of recognition that had passed between herself and the Duke. From a moment, she had spent half the night convincing herself she had imagined or misinterpreted, for surely a man of his station had merely been exercising the courtesy expected of his rank, nothing more, and surely she was a fool to read meaning into a simple gesture of retrieving a fallen napkin. She dressed in her plainest morning gown, a faded grey muslin that had seen 3 seasons of wear, and made her way downstairs expecting the day to unfold, as all such days did during these matrimonial visits. Vivienne holding court in the drawing-room, their father orchestrating opportunities for the prospective suitor to admire his eldest daughter's accomplishments, Eleanor herself fading into the wallpaper or retreating to the kitchens to assist with tasks beneath the notice of family but suited to her liminal position in the household. But when she entered the breakfast room, she found her father and Vivienne already present and wearing expressions of barely concealed surprise, and her father announced without preamble that the Duke had requested a tour of the gardens and had specifically asked that Eleanor serve as his guide. As he had been given to understand, she maintained them. The words struck Eleanor like stones, each one requiring examination for hidden meaning or mockery, and she stood frozen in the doorway while her father continued, saying that naturally the Duke was simply being polite, making conversation before the serious business of courtship began, and Eleanor should oblige him for an hour or so before making herself scarce so that Vivienne might join them for the remainder of the morning. Vivienne's expression flickered with something Eleanor could not quite name, not concern, certainly, for Vivienne had never concerned herself with Eleanor's activities, but perhaps a faint puzzlement that the Duke should request the company of the forgotten sister when the radiant one sat readily available. Eleanor nodded her acceptance, her voice apparently having retreated along with her courage, and 20 minutes later found herself walking beside Duke Adrian Rothwell along the gravel paths of her mother's garden, the morning mist still clinging to the roses like a benediction, the air cool and smelling of earth, and the green promise of growing things. They walked in silence for several moments, Eleanor acutely conscious of his presence beside her, the way his height required her to look up to see his face, the careful distance he maintained that spoke of respect rather than indifference, and finally he spoke, asking her how long she had tended these gardens, and something in the genuine curiosity of his tone loosened the tight grip of anxiety in her chest. She found herself answering honestly, telling him that her mother had planted the roses 20 years ago, that Eleanor had worked beside her as a child, learning the names of each variety and the particular needs of their cultivation, and that after her mother's death she had taken on the garden's care as a kind of sacred trust, the one inheritance that had been hers alone. As she spoke, the words came easier, her usual careful guardedness falling away as she showed him her mother's favorite blooms, the deep crimson roses that symbolized enduring love, and the white ones her mother had called peace, the pale pink variety named for dawn and new beginnings, and she realized with a start that she was speaking with passion, with the animation she usually suppressed, and that Duke Adrian was listening with an attention that went beyond mere politeness. He asked questions that demonstrated he was truly hearing her, about the soil composition and the challenges of maintaining old roses, about whether she had added varieties of her own and what had guided her choices. And when she paused, suddenly self-conscious, he smiled at her with such warmth that she felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, the treacherous hope that perhaps, impossibly, she had not imagined that moment of connection after all, that perhaps this stranger with sorrow in his eyes saw something in her that her own family had long since ceased to seek. As October deepened into gold and crimson, the trees surrounding the Ashford estate transforming into flames of colour that would have seemed garish had they not been so heartbreakingly beautiful, Duke Adrian Rothwell became a recurring presence in Eleanor's carefully ordered existence, arriving 2 and sometimes 3 times each week, with a regularity that began to unsettle the household's assumptions about the purpose of his visits. He came ostensibly to call upon the family, to continue his evaluation of Vivienne as a prospective bride, but each visit inevitably found him seeking Eleanor's company, requesting her guidance through the gardens, even as the flowers began their retreat toward winter dormancy, asking her opinion on books he had brought from his own library, engaging her in conversations that stretched from literature to philosophy to the nature of grief and the possibility of joy after loss. Eleanor found herself anticipating his arrivals with a mixture of exhilaration and dread, for each conversation peeled back another layer of the protective numbness she had cultivated, exposing raw places in her heart she had thought safely buried, and yet she could not bring herself to retreat from the unprecedented gift of his attention, the intoxicating experience of being truly heard by another soul. They spoke of poetry. He admired Wordsworth while she defended Byron's passionate darkness, and of the social obligations that constrained them both. Adrian confessing that he had spent the 2 years since his wife's death performing the role of the grieving duke, while inside feeling more relief than sorrow, for his marriage had been arranged by their families, and though he had respected Catherine and mourned her loss, he had never known the connection of minds and spirits that he had been taught to believe was merely romantic fiction. Eleanor listened to these revelations with wonder, understanding for the first time that even those who appeared to have everything society valued, title, wealth, and position, could experience their own forms of invisibility, their own imprisonment in roles that denied their essential selves. It was during his 5th visit, on an afternoon when grey clouds promised rain and the wind scattered the last crimson leaves across the garden paths, that Adrian discovered the leather notebook Eleanor had left on the stone bench while she cut back the season's final roses, and before she could prevent him, he had opened it and begun reading the verses she had written there, poetry she had never shown to any living soul, words that laid bare her loneliness and longing, her observations of beauty in small things, her belief that even forgotten gardens could bloom again if tended with enough love. She stood frozen in mortification, certain he would mock or pity her amateur efforts, but when he looked up, his eyes held an expression of such profound respect that she felt tears threaten, and he asked her permission to read more, saying that her words captured truths he had felt but never possessed the skill to express, and would she trust him enough to share this part of herself, as she had already shared her knowledge of roses and her thoughts on grief. From that moment something shifted between them, the conversation moving from the careful courtesy of new acquaintance to the deeper intimacy of genuine friendship, and Eleanor felt both terrified and alive in ways she had not experienced since before her mother's death, aware that she was opening herself to inevitable pain when this interlude ended, and the Duke made his expected choice of Vivienne, yet unable to resist the profound human need to be seen, to be known, to matter to another person, even if only temporarily. Within the house, the family had begun to notice the pattern of Adrian's attention, with growing confusion and concern. Her father dismissed it as an eccentric nobleman's way of being thorough, perhaps examining how the lesser daughter behaved to predict the true character of the elder, while Vivienne's expression during the Duke's visits had begun to show the first flickers of something Eleanor recognized with surprise as jealousy, a tightness around her sister's perfect mouth, when Adrian excused himself from Vivienne's performance at the pianoforte to ask Eleanor's opinion on a passage from the book he carried, though surely, Eleanor told herself in the darkness of her room each night, surely Vivienne had no cause for jealousy, for when the time came Adrian would make the sensible choice, the expected choice, and Eleanor would return to her shadows bearing the bittersweet gift of having been, for one brief autumn, unforgotten. It was on a grey afternoon in late October, when the garden had surrendered most of its colour to the advancing winter and the roses stood in their final bloom before dormancy, that Eleanor and Adrian sat together on the stone bench, beneath her mother's arbour, and spoke truths they had perhaps never voiced to another living soul, the conversation beginning with literature and philosophy, as their talks often did, but deepening into territory far more dangerous, far more intimate, until Eleanor found herself holding her breath between his words, as though each revelation were a gift she feared to disturb with sudden movement. Adrian spoke of his marriage to Catherine, how their families had arranged the match when he was 23 and she barely 19, how they had tried with genuine effort to build affection from duty and had achieved a respectful partnership that satisfied society's expectations while leaving both of them, he suspected, privately lonely in ways neither had dared name aloud, and how her death in childbed 2 years past had filled him with grief, not only for the loss of her life and their child's, but for the loss of the possibility that they might have eventually found the deeper connection both had, perhaps secretly longed for. He described the loneliness of his position, the way every interaction in society felt like a performance, the Duke of Silverton playing his role with appropriate gravity and charm, while the man inside that title hungered for genuine recognition, for someone who might see past the trappings of rank to the human soul beneath, and Eleanor listened with her heart beating so hard she feared he must hear it, and understanding for the first time that the isolation she had known in her family's house existed in different forms, even in the grandest estates, even behind the most envied titles. When he finished speaking, he looked at her with such vulnerable honesty that she found her own walls crumbling, and she heard herself telling him what she had never told anyone about the decade since her mother's death, when she had become increasingly invisible to her family, how she had learned to move through the house like a ghost, performing her small services and retreating to her safe places, how she had convinced herself this half-life was enough, because the alternative, allowing herself to want more, to believe she deserved more, would have broken her entirely. She spoke of the peculiar pain of being unseen by those who should love you most, of watching her sister receive all their father's attention and pride, while Eleanor was forgotten at the breakfast table, passed over in conversation, excluded from family decisions, as though she were a servant rather than a daughter, and she was surprised to find tears on her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself to shed in Adrian's presence, the first she had allowed herself to shed at all in longer than she could recall. As she spoke, he had shifted closer on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, and when she fell silent, he reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, and took her hand in his. The first deliberate touch between them beyond that initial moment with the fallen napkin, and the contact sent such a shock of recognition through her that she nearly pulled away from the intensity of it, from the dangerous promise of connection it represented. He held her hand gently, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm as though soothing a frightened creature, and he said in a voice rough with emotion, "You see the world in colors others miss, Eleanor. You find beauty in what others overlook, and perhaps that is because you yourself have been overlooked. But I want you to know that I see you. I have seen you from that first evening, and every conversation we have shared has only made you more vivid to me, more essential, more impossible to imagine my life without." And Eleanor felt hope and terror war within her chest, hope that this impossible thing might be real, terror that she was misunderstanding, that this would end, that allowing herself to believe in it would destroy her more thoroughly than a decade of invisibility ever had, and yet she could not bring herself to pull her hand from his, could not bring herself to retreat from this moment that felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, terrified and exhilarated, alive in ways she had forgotten were possible. Eleanor should have known that hope was a luxury the forgotten could not afford. For the very evening after that transformative conversation in the garden, her father summoned her to his study with a coldness in his voice that transported her instantly back to childhood, to all the times she had displeased him simply by existing in ways that did not serve his purposes, and she stood before his desk like a prisoner awaiting sentence, while he informed her in clipped, furious tones that she was embarrassing the family, that her inappropriate monopolization of the Duke's attention was jeopardizing Vivienne's prospects, that she had allowed herself delusions far above her station, and he would not permit her selfish behavior to ruin her sister's chance at the match they had all been working toward. He commanded her to cease spending time with the Duke entirely, to keep to her room during his visits, to remember her place as the lesser daughter, whose role was to support her sister's advancement, not to pathetically grasp at attentions clearly meant as mere politeness from a man too well-bred to show his boredom with her company, and each word landed like a stone on the fragile hope Eleanor had allowed to take root in her chest, crushing it beneath the weight of old certainties, old wounds she had been foolish to imagine could heal. When she returned to her room, her hands trembling and her vision blurred with tears, she refused to let fall until she was safely behind her closed door. She found Vivienne waiting for her, and her sister's beautiful face wore an expression of such calculated cruelty that Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as Vivienne spoke with honeyed venom, asking whether Eleanor had truly been foolish enough to believe that someone like the Duke of Silverton, a man who could have any woman in England, would genuinely want someone like her, plain and poor and pathetic. Did she really imagine that his polite attentions meant anything beyond a sophisticated man's way of passing time in the country? And perhaps Eleanor had been alone so long she had forgotten how to read social situations, mistaking courtesy for genuine interest. But Vivienne was telling her this for her own good, to spare her the greater humiliation that would come when Adrian inevitably made his true choice, and Eleanor's ridiculous hopes were exposed for the desperate fantasies they had always been. The words found every vulnerable place in Eleanor's heart, every doubt she had harbored beneath her growing hope, every piece of her that still believed she deserved the invisibility she had endured, and she felt herself retreating into the numbness that had protected her for 10 years, felt the walls rebuilding around her heart, brick by brick, felt herself becoming again the ghost who moved through the house unseen and untouched by either love or pain. For surely this was what she had been meant for all along, and the past weeks had been nothing but a beautiful delusion, a brief dream before waking to the unchangeable reality of her place in the world. When Adrian arrived for his next visit 2 days later, Eleanor kept to her room as commanded, sitting by her window with a book she could not read, hearing the sounds of the household below, imagining him in the drawing room with Vivienne, telling herself that this was right, this was proper, this was how it should be, and had always been going to be. And when one of the servants came to tell her that the Duke had asked for her, had seemed confused by her absence, she sent word that she was indisposed and could not receive visitors, hating herself for the cowardice, even as she could not bring herself to face him, to see in his eyes the confirmation that her father and sister had been right about everything, that she had mistaken kindness for something deeper and had made herself ridiculous in the process, and so she retreated into the safe darkness of being forgotten, where hope could not reach her and therefore could not destroy her, unaware that in the rooms below, Adrian was receiving her message with growing alarm, with questions her family deflected with smooth lies, with a dawning understanding that something was terribly wrong and a determination that he would not accept her absence without knowing its true cause. For he had not spent weeks learning to see Eleanor Ashford, only to watch her disappear back into the shadows her family had tried to confine her to, and the Duke of Silverton, when committed to a course of action, was not a man easily deterred. 3 days passed like years, each hour stretching into an eternity of silence that pressed against Eleanor's chest until she could barely draw breath. While in the rooms below and in the world beyond her self-imposed exile, Adrian Rothwell found himself confronting a situation that transformed his concern into something harder and more dangerous, a cold fury at injustice that reminded him he was not merely a man in love, but a duke with power. He had been too gentle to wield until circumstance demanded it. On the second day of Eleanor's absence, he had asked her father directly why Miss Eleanor no longer joined them, his tone carefully polite, but edged with an insistence that made Lord Ashford shift uncomfortably before offering the rehearsed explanation that Eleanor was indisposed, a feminine complaint that would pass in time, nothing that need concern his grace, and perhaps they might discuss the arrangements for the upcoming county assembly, where Vivienne would be delighted to dance the first set with him if he would do her the honor. Adrian had accepted this deflection with surface courtesy, while filing away the smoothness of the lie. The way Lord Ashford's eyes slid away from his the performance of paternal concern that rang hollow against what Adrian had learned of this family's dynamics over the past weeks, and he had smiled and made appropriate noises about the assembly, while his mind worked through the situation with the strategic precision that had made him successful in both business and politics, recognizing that direct confrontation would only cause Eleanor's family to guard her more closely, but that information was a form of power, and he needed to understand the true shape of what he was facing. It was Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper who had served the Ashford family for 30 years and who had watched Eleanor grow from a cherished child into a ghost, who finally gave him the truth, approaching him in the garden on the afternoon of the third day, with the kind of courage that comes from having endured too much silence and finding herself unable to bear it any longer. And she told him in quiet, urgent tones that Miss Eleanor was not ill but confined to her quarters by her father's order, that she had been forbidden from seeing the Duke again, that the household whispered about the confrontation in Lord Ashford's study and Miss Vivienne's subsequent visit to her sister's room, and that Eleanor had not emerged since except to take meals alone, her face pale, and her eyes holding the blank distance of someone who had retreated back into the protective numbness that had sustained her through years of systematic erasure. Adrian listened to Mrs. Brennan's testimony with a stillness that concealed the rage building in his chest, a fury not hot but ice-cold, the kind of anger that clarifies rather than clouds, and he thanked her with genuine warmth and a promise that her loyalty to Eleanor would not be forgotten before returning to his rooms at the inn where he had taken lodgings, declining another evening at the Ashford house, with apologies about correspondence that required his attention, and there, in the private space of his temporary chambers, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he now understood, that the woman he had come to love was being treated as a prisoner in her own home for the crime of being seen by someone who valued her, and that the family who should have protected her had instead become her jailers, and this he would not permit to continue. Adrian arrived at the Ashford house the following morning, not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as a duke claiming his right of access, and when the butler attempted to turn him away with stammered apologies about the family not receiving visitors, Adrian simply fixed him with a look that had made members of Parliament reconsider their positions, and stated in tones that permitted no argument that he would wait in the library until Miss Eleanor could be informed of his presence, walking past the flustered servant before objections could be formulated, his intimate knowledge of the house's layout from previous visits guiding him to the one room he suspected Eleanor might be found if she had ventured from her chambers, for she had once mentioned that the library had been her mother's favorite room, and he had observed how her fingers trailed along the spines of books with the tenderness of someone touching sacred relics. He found her there as he had hoped, seated in the window alcove with autumn light falling across her face and a volume of poetry open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the gardens beyond the glass, with an expression of such profound emptiness that it struck him like a physical blow. And when she sensed his presence and turned, the flash of joy that illuminated her features before being ruthlessly suppressed told him everything he needed to know about what these 3 days of separation had cost her, how she had been waging war against her own hope, and he felt his careful control slip as he crossed the room toward her with urgent purpose. Eleanor rose from her seat with a wariness that broke his heart, holding up one hand as if to maintain distance between them, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the hollow quality of someone reciting a lesson learned through pain, telling him that he should not be here, that her father had forbidden it, and that she apologized for any misunderstanding her behavior might have caused, but she recognized now that she had misinterpreted his kindness, and she would not presume further on his time or patience, and with each word, Adrian felt his fury at her family intensify, even as he ached for the wounds they had reopened in her, the decade of conditioning that made her retreat into invisibility the moment someone tried to erase her again. He moved closer despite her protests, stopping only when he stood directly before her, near enough to see the tears she was fighting against, the trembling of her hands, the desperate hope she was trying to kill before it could destroy her. And he spoke then with an intensity that made her finally meet his eyes, telling her that he knew what her family had done, what they had said to her, and that he would not permit her to vanish back into the shadows they had tried to confine her to, that she was not a misunderstanding or a mistake or a foolish hope, but the most real thing he had encountered in years of performing the role society expected of him. Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling over now as she whispered that he did not understand, that she was not what he thought, that she was the forgotten one for reason, and that 10 years of being unseen had taught her the truth of her own negligible worth, and her voice cracked on the words, as if speaking them aloud was costing her everything she had left. Adrian reached for her then, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the passion in his voice as he said, "For 10 years you have survived being unseen, Eleanor, but I see you, I have, from the first moment our eyes met across that dinner table. I have seen you in every conversation we have shared, in every word of poetry you trusted me with, in the way you tend your mother's roses, as if love itself could bloom from careful attention, and what I see is not someone forgotten but someone unforgettable, not someone of negligible worth but someone of such profound value that your family's blindness to it speaks only to their poverty of vision, not to any lack in you." And before she could protest again, before the walls could rebuild completely, he kissed her with all the certainty he felt, with weeks of accumulated longing and newfound understanding and determination that she would not be erased, and after a moment of shocked stillness, Eleanor's defenses crumbled, and she kissed him back with a hunger that spoke of 10 years of being untouched, unseen, unloved, her hands clutching his coat as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had taught her to expect dissolution. And when they finally drew apart, both were trembling, both irrevocably changed, both aware that this moment had transformed what was possible, and that there would be no returning to the careful distance that had come before. For hope, once truly kindled, cannot be easily extinguished, and Eleanor felt it flooding through her despite her fear, despite everything, a terrifying and exhilarating rush of possibility that perhaps, impossibly, she might be allowed to step from shadow into light. They remained in the library's golden stillness for a moment that stretched beyond time, wrapped in the fragile peace of shared truth and tentative hope. But peace in the Ashford house was a commodity that had never been granted to Eleanor for long, and fate, or perhaps simply her father's suspicious nature, intervened with the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the door opening without the courtesy of a knock. Lord Ashford entering with the presumption of ownership to find his forgotten daughter in the arms of the Duke he had intended for Vivienne, and the rage that suffused his features transformed him into something terrible and previously concealed, a fury that had perhaps always existed beneath his studied indifference, but had never before been directed at someone he considered too insignificant to warrant such intense emotion. What followed happened with the terrible momentum of an avalanche, Lord Ashford's bellow bringing servants running and family emerging from various rooms, Vivienne appearing in the doorway with calculated timing that suggested she had been waiting for precisely this confrontation, and within moments Eleanor found herself at the center of a scene she had spent 10 years avoiding, visibility of the most scorching and humiliating kind, as her father's accusations filled the library with a venom that made even the servants flinch. Calling her a manipulator who had schemed to entrap a duke, a social climber who had used her position in the household to ingratiate herself through deception, an embarrassment to the family name who had always been more trouble than she was worth, and did she imagine that someone of Silverton's standing could truly want someone as unremarkable and forgettable as herself? Did she think her pathetic attempts at poetry and her dirt-stained hands from grubbing in gardens made her suitable to be a duchess? And how dare she? How dare she presume to reach above her station when she had been given shelter and sustenance, despite her profound uselessness to the family's prospects? Eleanor stood frozen in the face of this onslaught, decades of conditioning making her want to shrink and disappear and apologize for the space she occupied. But she felt Adrian's presence beside her like an anchor, and when her father paused for breath, Vivienne stepped forward with tears streaming down her beautiful face in a performance of wounded betrayal, declaring in tones of theatrical anguish that she had trusted Eleanor and had thought, despite everything, that they were sisters, and yet Eleanor had deliberately stolen the one man who had shown interest in their family and had used her wiles and her pretense of intellectual interests to manipulate a grieving widower. And how could Eleanor do this to her? How could she be so cruel, so selfish, so calculating in her destruction of Vivienne's one chance at happiness? The words struck like physical blows, each accusation designed to wound, because Vivienne alone among the family understood Eleanor well enough to know precisely where she was most vulnerable, and Eleanor felt something inside her beginning to crack under the assault. the careful walls she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of exposure starting to crumble. But before she could retreat into the numbness that had sustained her through years of smaller cruelties, Adrian moved, stepping forward with a stillness that was somehow more commanding than any shout. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold aristocratic authority that reminded everyone present exactly who he was and what power he wielded in the wider world beyond this provincial household. "You will not speak to her this way," Adrian said, and each word fell like a judge's gavel, creating silence in its wake, his eyes moving from Lord Ashford to Vivienne with an expression that made both of them step back instinctively. "You will not make accusations about a woman whose character you have systematically failed to recognize, and you will certainly not pretend that your anger stems from concern for propriety, when what truly enrages you is that someone has finally seen value where you have insisted there was none." And the authority in his voice, the utter conviction, created a space in which something unprecedented could occur, for Eleanor felt the crack inside her widening not into collapse but into opening, and before she fully understood what she was doing, she found her own voice rising, quiet at first but growing stronger, and she began, finally, after 10 years of silence, to speak her truth. Eleanor's voice, when it emerged, was not loud, did not need to be, for it carried the weight of 10 years of accumulated silence, and she spoke without anger but with a truth that was somehow more devastating than any rage could have been, telling them in tones that trembled only slightly that she had been a ghost in this house since the day her mother died, that she had set tables no one thanked her for setting, had arranged flowers no one noticed, had maintained her mother's gardens, because someone needed to remember that love had once existed within these walls, and she had done this not expecting gratitude, but hoping at least for acknowledgement that she existed and that she was a daughter and a sister and a person worthy of basic consideration, and she recounted for them now the small accumulated cruelties of invisibility, the birthdays forgotten, the Christmases where gifts were an afterthought, the conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, not because she had interrupted, but because her presence was considered so negligible that it did not warrant adjustment, the years of being told through silence and indifference that she was less than, worth less than, deserving of less than the space she occupied. She spoke of watching Vivienne receive every advantage, every opportunity, every ounce of their father's pride and attention, and she said clearly that she did not begrudge her sister these things, that Vivienne deserved love and recognition, but that somehow in this household it had been decided that there was only enough worth acknowledging for one daughter, and Eleanor had been designated the one who would exist in shadow so that Vivienne could shine more brightly, and she had accepted this role with as much grace as she could summon because she had loved them, had wanted desperately to be loved in return, but she understood now that she had been waiting for something that would never be freely given, that she had been teaching them through her acceptance of mistreatment, that she agreed with their assessment of her value, and she would not do that anymore, could not do that anymore. Not after Adrian had shown her what it felt like to be truly seen, and she had remembered that her mother had once looked at her with pride and called her remarkable and told her that quiet strength was its own form of courage. Eleanor's words fell into a silence that had gone from hostile to stunned, for none of them had ever heard her speak more than a few sentences together, certainly had never heard her claim space and voice and truth with such devastating clarity, and she looked at her father now with eyes that no longer sought his approval, and told him that she would be leaving this house, that she was grateful for the shelter she had been given, but that she could not remain in a place where her existence was treated as an inconvenience, and this decision was hers alone, made not because of Adrian's attention, but because she had finally recognized that she deserved more than the crumbs of consideration she had been surviving on, and whether Adrian wished to continue their acquaintance or not, she would not return to being invisible, would not teach another generation that some people were born to be forgotten, while others were born to be celebrated, and she said to her father with a finality that allowed no argument, "I have been a ghost in this house since Mother died, existing in the spaces between your attention to more important matters, but I will not be a ghost anymore. I choose to be real, to be seen, to be acknowledged as having worth, and if this family cannot give me that, then I will find it elsewhere, for I have learned that it is better to be alone and visible to oneself than to be surrounded by people who look through you as if you are made of glass." The transformation in the room was palpable, servants weeping openly now at this quiet rebellion, Lord Ashford's face cycling through rage and shock, and something that might have been recognition of his own culpability. Vivienne frozen in her performance of wounded betrayal, as if uncertain how to proceed when her usual tools had proven ineffective. And Adrian watching Eleanor with an expression of profound admiration and love that made her feel for the first time that perhaps her voice, so long suppressed, had been worth the waiting, worth the fear of speaking, for in claiming her own worth, she had discovered a power she had not known. She possessed the power of a woman who finally, after years of erasure, refuses to be erased any longer. Into the charged silence that followed Eleanor's declaration, Adrian stepped forward with the deliberate grace of a man who had made his decision long before this moment and was now simply claiming what had always been inevitable, and he addressed not Eleanor first but her family, his voice carrying that same aristocratic authority, but now tempered with something warmer, a conviction that transcended social obligation and entered the realm of absolute certainty, and he said to Lord Ashford with perfect formality, "I came to this house at your invitation to consider a marriage alliance, and I have indeed found a woman I wish to make my Duchess, though not the daughter you anticipated offering," and he let those words settle before continuing, his gaze moving to encompass Vivienne, whose performance had faltered into genuine uncertainty. "Miss Vivienne is indeed accomplished and beautiful, everything society values in a potential bride, but I am not looking for accomplishment or beauty alone. I seek partnership, intellectual companionship, a meeting of souls that transcends the superficial arrangements that pass for marriage among our class." And then he turned to Eleanor with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat, for she saw in his eyes not pity or charity, but recognition and respect, and something that looked terrifyingly like love, and he addressed her as he might address an equal in a negotiation of profound importance, saying, "Miss Eleanor, I came to this house looking for a wife, and I found something far rarer. I found my equal, someone who sees the world with poet's eyes and a philosopher's mind, who has survived a decade of erasure with grace and dignity that would break lesser souls, and who tends gardens and writes verses, and carries within her a depth of feeling that most people spend lifetimes never discovering." And he stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, and he said with a formality that somehow made the words more rather than less intimate, "I am asking you, Eleanor Ashford, if you would consent to become my wife, to be the Duchess of Silverton, not because I am rescuing you from your circumstances, but because I cannot imagine facing the future without your particular wisdom and warmth beside me, because conversations with you have taught me that I had been merely existing rather than living, because when I look at you, I see not the forgotten daughter, but the unforgettable woman, and I would be honored beyond measure if you would allow me to spend the rest of my life ensuring that you are seen and heard and valued as you deserve." Eleanor felt the world narrow to this moment, this impossible offering, and fear rose in her throat like bile, because surely this could not be real. Surely he did not understand what he was proposing, and she heard herself saying with a tremor she could not control, "You would tie yourself to the forgotten daughter? Your reputation, your standing in society, they will say you were bewitched or have lost your reason, that you chose the inferior sister out of some perverse rebellion against propriety," and she searched his face for doubt or hesitation, or the first signs of reconsideration. But Adrian only smiled with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unshed tears, and he reached for her hand with a questioning gesture that gave her every opportunity to refuse, and when she did not pull away, he took her fingers in his and said with absolute conviction, "You are unforgettable, Eleanor. You have been from the start, from the moment you looked at me across your father's dining table with sadness and intelligence in your eyes, from our first conversation in the garden when you spoke of roses as if they were old friends, and from every subsequent meeting when I discovered new layers of wit and compassion and quiet courage in you, and I am not rescuing you any more than you are rescuing me, for we are simply two people who have recognized in each other the possibility of genuine partnership, of being truly known and truly valued, and I am placing this choice entirely in your hands, because that is what partnership means. I will not sweep you away on some tide of aristocratic presumption, but I will stand beside you if you choose to walk forward into a different future, and whatever you decide I will support, and for your agency and your voice matter more than my desires." The proposal hung in the air between them, weighty with possibility and terror, and the faint, fragile hope that perhaps, after 10 years of invisibility, Eleanor Ashford might finally step into the light and allow herself to be fully, gloriously, unforgettably seen. Eleanor stood in the center of the drawing room with Adrian's proposal hanging in the air like something fragile and impossibly precious, and she felt the weight of 10 years pressing against this single moment of choice, 10 years of conditioning that whispered she was not worthy of such love, that she should decline gracefully and spare him the embarrassment of having chosen incorrectly, that women like her, forgotten daughters, invisible sisters, ghosts in their own homes, did not get to step into fairy tales and claim happy endings. And yet even as these familiar voices of doubt rose within her, she felt something else stirring, a memory surfacing from the years before her mother's death, when she had been small and loved and seen. And she remembered with sudden crystalline clarity an afternoon in the rose garden when her mother had knelt beside her and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and said, "Eleanor, my darling, you have a quiet courage that will serve you all your life. You see deeply, you feel deeply, and when the moment comes for you to choose your own path, do not let fear make you small, for you were born to bloom just as surely as these roses, and the right soil and the right light will come when you are ready to grow toward them." And Eleanor understood now that her mother had somehow known, had seen the future unfolding, and had planted seeds of worth in her daughter's heart that 10 years of neglect had not quite managed to kill. And she looked at Adrian, seeing not rescuer or escape, but partnership and recognition, and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of being fully known. And she thought of the rose garden outside these windows, how her mother's bushes had seemed dead each winter, but came back each spring more glorious than before, because their roots ran deep and true. And she understood that she too had roots, that invisibility had not erased her, but had perhaps prepared her for this moment, by teaching her to value substance over appearance, depth over shallow brilliance, authentic connection over performative charm. She drew a breath that felt like the first real breath she had taken in a decade, and she looked first at her father, whose face showed confusion and anger at having his authority challenged, then at Vivienne, whose perfect facade had cracked to reveal genuine uncertainty beneath, then at the servants who watched with tears streaming down their faces as if witnessing something they had long hoped for but never expected to see, and finally she looked at Adrian, whose grey eyes held steady on hers with patience and love and absolute faith in whatever she chose, and she felt something shift inside her chest, some iron band that had been constricting her heart for 10 years finally loosening, and she heard her own voice emerge clear and strong as she said, "I have spent 10 years believing that I was forgotten because I was forgettable, that I was unseen because I was unworthy of sight, and I have made myself small and quiet and unobtrusive because I thought that was what I deserved. But you have shown me, Adrian, that I was teaching others how to treat me through my acceptance of mistreatment, and my mother knew before she died that I had worth even if I forgot it for a while, and I choose now to remember, to reclaim what was always true even when I could not see it. I choose myself, my voice, my value, my right to exist fully and be acknowledged fully, and in choosing myself, I find that I can also choose you, can choose this partnership you offer, not because I need rescuing, but because I recognize in you someone who sees truly and loves deeply and offers not a cage however gilded, but a garden in which we might both grow toward light." And she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand in his, and said with a smile that felt like sunrise after endless night, "Yes, Adrian Rothwell, I will marry you. I will be your duchess and your partner and your equal, and together we will build a life where being seen and being valued are not rare gifts but daily certainties." The room erupted then in varied reactions, her father's outraged sputtering, Vivienne's shocked silence, the servants' open weeping and barely suppressed cheers. But Eleanor heard none of it, because Adrian had pulled her close and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that she felt herself finally, fully, unforgettably seen. As autumn turned toward winter and the trees outside Ashford Manor surrendered their last leaves to the increasingly bitter wind, Eleanor found herself engaged in the strange, intimate work of packing a life she had never truly been permitted to live fully, moving through rooms that had been her prison for a decade with the surreal knowledge that she would soon leave them forever. And there was grief in this despite everything, because these walls had witnessed her mother's love before they had witnessed her father's indifference, and she found herself reclaiming pieces of her history that had been slowly erased over the years. Her mother's jewelry box that had been relocated to Vivienne's room, the watercolor paintings Eleanor herself had done as a girl that had been taken down and stored in the attic, books inscribed with her mother's handwriting that had somehow migrated to her father's study, as if Eleanor had no right to inherit her own mother's love of literature, and with each recovered item, she felt herself becoming more solid, more real, as if these physical objects were proof that she had indeed existed before her erasure and would continue to exist after her liberation. The servants who had shown her small kindnesses over the years came to her room in quiet moments to offer tearful farewells and whispered blessings, and Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, pressed a package of seeds from the rose garden into Eleanor's hands and said with fierce affection, "Your mother would be so proud of you, Miss Eleanor, and so very proud that you chose yourself and chose love and chose to bloom." And Eleanor wept then because she understood that she had been seen all along by these women who had no power to intervene but had witnessed her suffering and had held hope for her liberation even when she had stopped holding it for herself. On her third evening of preparation, there came a soft knock at her door, and Vivienne entered without invitation, and Eleanor braced herself for another performance of wounded sisterhood or cutting cruelty, but instead her sister closed the door carefully behind her and stood in the center of the room, looking suddenly young and lost, and nothing like the brilliant golden daughter who had reigned over the household for a decade. And Vivienne said with a rawness Eleanor had never heard from her, "I have been cruel to you, and I could claim it was because Father encouraged the competition between us, or because I did not understand what I was doing, but the truth is that I was afraid. Afraid that if anyone looked at you too closely, they would see that your quiet depth was worth more than my loud brilliance, that your genuine feeling was more valuable than my perfect performance, and I have spent 10 years keeping you small so that I could continue to feel large, and I have been so unhappy, Eleanor, so desperately unhappy in my golden cage, while you at least had your garden and your books and your authentic self, even if no one acknowledged it, and I watch you preparing to leave with a man who sees you truly, and I realize that I have never been truly seen, because I have never shown anyone my true self, and I am trapped in a role I created and now cannot escape." And the sisters looked at each other across the room with an honesty that had never existed between them, both trapped in different ways by their father's limited love and their mother's absence, and Eleanor felt her anger at Vivienne soften into something more complex, a recognition that they had both been victims of a household that could not hold space for two daughters to be fully themselves, and she said gently, "Vivienne, you can choose differently too. It is not too late to step off the pedestal and discover who you are when you are not performing. And if you ever want that freedom, if you ever need a place to discover your authentic self, you will be welcome at Silverton, for we are sisters, and that means something even after everything that has passed between us." And Vivienne nodded, with tears streaming down her perfect face, before fleeing the room, as if she could not bear such vulnerable honesty for another moment, leaving Eleanor to finish her packing with a strange mixture of grief and hope and the profound understanding that leaving this house meant leaving behind not just pain, but also the last connections to her childhood and her mother, and the girl she had been before invisibility had taught her to disappear. The wedding took place 3 weeks after Eleanor's acceptance in the small parish church at the edge of the Ashford estate, and it was Eleanor's choice to keep the ceremony intimate rather than the grand social spectacle her father had once envisioned for Vivienne, for she had spent 10 years being invisible in crowds, and she wanted this moment to be about genuine witness rather than performative display. And so the guest list included only those who had truly seen her Mrs. Henderson and the kitchen staff who had shown her kindness, the vicar who had allowed her to borrow books from his library when her own had been restricted, Adrian's closest friend, Lord Pemberton, who had looked at Eleanor during their introduction and said simply, "Ah, so you are the one who brought light back to his eyes," and Vivienne, who sat pale and quiet in the third pew, as if bearing witness to a future she might never claim for herself. Eleanor prepared for the ceremony in her childhood bedroom for the last time, and she wore her mother's pearls that she had reclaimed from Vivienne's jewelry box. And Mrs. Henderson had helped her dress in a gown of cream silk that was elegant in its simplicity, no elaborate embellishments or desperate attempts to transform her into something she was not, and she carried a bouquet of roses from her mother's garden, late autumn blooms that had survived the first frost through sheer stubborn determination to flower. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw not the invisible, forgotten daughter, but a woman who had chosen herself and had been chosen in return, and her hands trembled only slightly as she descended the stairs. The church was filled with winter morning light that streamed through simple windows and illuminated the worn wooden pews, and there was no orchestra or elaborate decoration, but instead a single violin playing a melody that Adrian had told her was his late mother's favorite. And when Eleanor entered on no one's arm because she had politely refused her father's offer, knowing that he had not earned the right to give away what he had never properly valued, she walked alone down the aisle toward her future, and she saw Adrian turn to watch her approach, and the expression on his face held such open wonder and joy and recognition that she felt tears threaten, though she blinked them back because she wanted to see this moment clearly. They wanted to remember every detail of being witnessed and celebrated and chosen. They had written their own vows in the days leading up to the ceremony, sitting together in the library at Ashford Manor while the household bustled around them. And when the vicar asked Adrian to speak his promises, he took Eleanor's hands in his and said with quiet intensity, "Eleanor, I vow to see you truly every day of our lives together, to witness not just your joys but your sorrows, not just your strengths but your vulnerabilities, to create space where you need never make yourself small or quiet or invisible, and to build with you a partnership of equals, where your voice matters as much as mine, and your dreams are as worthy of pursuit as any I might hold." And Eleanor felt the words settle into her heart, like seeds being planted in fertile soil. And when it was her turn to speak, she looked into his grey eyes and said with a steadiness that surprised her, "Adrian, I vow to bring my whole self to this marriage, my depth and my complexity, my poetry and my passion for growing things, my grief for what was lost and my hope for what we will build. And I vow to trust that your seeing of me is true, even when old voices whisper that I am forgettable, and to honor the courage it took for both of us to choose authentic love over convenient arrangement." And the vicar pronounced them husband and wife as the winter sun reached its apex and filled the church with crystalline light. They departed Ashford Manor in Adrian's carriage as husband and wife, while servants threw rose petals that Mrs. Henderson had dried and saved from the summer. And Eleanor looked back once at the house that had been her prison and her home, and she saw her father standing rigid at the entrance, and Vivienne at an upper window with her hand pressed against the glass, as if reaching towards something she could not quite grasp. And Eleanor felt not triumph but a complex mixture of grief and liberation, and hope that someday her sister might also choose to leave the golden cage and discover who she was beyond performance. And then the carriage rounded the bend, and the manor disappeared behind winter-bare trees, and Eleanor turned to face forward toward Silverton and the future, and Adrian reached for her hand and brought it to his lips and said softly, "Welcome to the rest of our lives, my unforgettable Eleanor." And she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I am ready to be seen." The journey to Silverton took most of the afternoon through countryside that gradually transformed from the familiar landscapes of Eleanor's childhood into territory she had never seen, rolling hills, giving way to ancient forests, and then emerging into parkland that seemed to stretch endlessly. And when the carriage finally rounded a curve and Adrian said softly, "There, that is home," Eleanor looked out to see an estate that took her breath away, not because of its grandeur, though it was indeed magnificent, because of the way the winter light fell across its stone facade, making it seem both imposing and somehow welcoming, and she felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest, because this vast, beautiful place was now meant to be hers, in a way that Ashford Manor had never been, even when she had lived there all her life. Adrian handed her down from the carriage himself rather than waiting for a footman, and as her feet touched the gravel drive, he kept hold of her hand and said with an intensity that made her throat tighten, "Eleanor, I want you to understand something from this first moment. This is not my house that you are entering as a guest, or even as a wife who must adapt herself to existing structures. This is our home, and I want you to feel free to change anything, arrange anything, claim any space as your own, for you are not filling a role here, but creating a life, and the difference matters more than I can express." And she nodded, because she could not yet speak past the emotion of being given permission to take up space after a decade of being told to make herself smaller. The staff had assembled in the entrance hall to meet their new Duchess, and Eleanor felt the familiar instinct to fade into the background, to make herself unremarkable and easily overlooked, but Adrian kept his hand at the small of her back, as if anchoring her in her new reality, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, came forward with a warm smile and said, "Welcome home, Your Grace. We are so very pleased to have you at Silverton," and Eleanor heard the genuine warmth in those words and felt disoriented by it, for she had grown so accustomed to being either ignored or merely tolerated that sincere welcome felt like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Adrian took her through the main rooms of the house, and she tried to absorb the beauty of the spaces, the library, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, the morning room painted in soft yellow that captured even winter's pale light, the gallery hung with portraits of Rothwell ancestors who seemed to watch her passage with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to enigmatic amusement. And in each room Adrian asked her opinion, asked what she thought of the arrangement, asked if she would like to change anything, and Eleanor realized with a shock that rippled through her entire body that he genuinely wanted her thoughts, that this was not performative courtesy, but real invitation to shape their shared life. When they reached the Duchess's chambers on the second floor, Adrian paused with his hand on the door and said with careful gentleness, "I had the staff prepare these rooms, but I told them to keep the decoration minimal, for these were my mother's rooms, and then briefly Catherine's, and I do not want you to feel that you are inhabiting someone else's space or living among another woman's choices." And when he opened the door, Eleanor saw a suite of beautiful rooms that had clearly been cleaned and aired but held almost no personal touches. The walls a neutral cream, the furniture elegant but impersonal, and Adrian continued, "I want you to redesign these completely, choose whatever colors call to you, whatever furniture suits your comfort, fill the shelves with your books, and the walls with art that speaks to your soul. For this is not Catherine's space that you are filling, Eleanor. This is your space to create from nothing, and I want you to feel that freedom." And Eleanor walked slowly into the room that was now meant to be her private sanctuary, and felt tears slip down her cheeks because the gift he was giving her was not just beautiful rooms, but permission to exist fully, to claim space, to be visible in her own home. That first night they dined alone in a small informal dining room, rather than the grand state dining room, and the conversation flowed easily between them, as it always had. But there was an additional layer now of nervous anticipation, for they were married, and this was their wedding night, and Eleanor had spent very little time thinking about the physical dimensions of marriage because she had been so focused on the emotional revelation of being chosen. And when Adrian reached across the table to take her hand and asked gently, "Are you frightened?" she considered the question seriously before answering, "Not of you, but of my own inexperience, of not knowing how to be a wife, of disappointing you after you have given me so much." And he brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles and said with tender honesty, "Then we are matched in our vulnerabilities, for I am terrified of being the kind of husband who takes rather than gives, who demands rather than invites, and I think perhaps we must simply promise to be gentle with each other as we learn how to build this intimacy together." And when he led her later to the connecting door between his chambers and hers, and asked, "May I?" with such careful respect for her autonomy, she felt something unlock in her chest, some final barrier of fear dissolving in the face of his consistent tenderness, and she said yes, not as submission but as choice, and they came together in the darkness with a vulnerability and care that felt like another kind of vow, another promise of mutual seeing. And afterward, as Eleanor lay in Adrian's arms in the large bed that was now theirs, she thought that this was what it meant to be truly witnessed, not just seen in daylight and public spaces, but known in darkness and private moments, not just valued for her pleasant qualities, but accepted in her wholeness. And she whispered into the quiet, "I did not know it could be like this." And Adrian pulled her closer and replied, "Neither did I, my unforgettable Eleanor, neither did I." As winter yielded to spring, as it always does, despite the long darkness that makes us doubt whether warmth will ever return, Eleanor found herself transforming in ways both visible and internal, for the months at Silverton had given her something she had never possessed at Ashford Manor, the space and permission to discover who she actually was beneath the layers of invisibility she had wrapped around herself for protection. She had redesigned the Duchess's chambers in shades of deep green and gold that reminded her of her mother's garden in its summer abundance, and she had filled the shelves with books of poetry and philosophy, and the notebooks where she continued to write her own verses, and when she woke each morning in rooms that reflected her own taste and sensibility rather than someone else's legacy, she felt a small thrill of recognition that this space, this life, truly belonged to her. The estate management became another unexpected avenue of self-discovery, for Adrian insisted on including her in decisions about tenants and land use and household accounts, and Eleanor found that she had a natural aptitude for understanding the complex web of relationships and responsibilities that sustained Silverton and Mrs. Blackwood remarked one afternoon with genuine respect that the Duchess had a gift for seeing what people needed before they had to ask for it, and Eleanor realized with a start that being seen herself had made her better at seeing others. That visibility was not a finite resource, but something that expanded the more it was practiced. She created new gardens that spring, working alongside the head gardener to design spaces that would bloom in succession from early spring through late autumn. And she brought cuttings from her mother's roses at Ashford and planted them in a sheltered corner where they would be protected from harsh winds. And as she knelt in the soil with her hands deep in the earth, she felt connected to something larger than herself, to the cycles of growth and dormancy and renewal that had nothing to do with being seen or forgotten, and everything to do with the quiet, persistent force of life itself. Adrian had discovered one of her poetry notebooks in the library where she had left it while cataloguing books, and rather than returning it with polite disinterest, he had read the poems carefully and then come to find her with an expression of such wonder and pride that Eleanor had felt embarrassed and exposed, and he had said with quiet intensity, "Eleanor, these are extraordinary. Have you ever considered publishing them?" And she had laughed at the impossibility of such a notion, but he had persisted, and eventually she had agreed to let him share a selection with his friend Lord Pemberton, who had connections in London's literary circles, and when word came back that a respected journal wanted to publish 3 of her poems under the anonymous signature E.A., Eleanor had felt a validation that went beyond even Adrian's love, for this was the world beyond Silverton, telling her that her inner life, her way of seeing, had value that extended beyond her personal relationships. The social challenges came as she had expected, for London society was intensely curious about the Duke of Silverton's unexpected choice of bride, and at their first major social appearance at Lady Pemberton's spring ball, Eleanor had felt the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing her ordinariness and finding her inexplicably inadequate for her position, and she had heard the whispers, "That is the Duchess? But she is so plain, and I heard she was practically a servant in her own family's house. How on earth did she capture Silverton?" And the old instinct to make herself smaller, to fade into the background, had risen up powerfully, but Adrian had kept his hand at her waist and whispered, "Let them look, let them wonder, for they will never understand that what I found in you is worth more than all their approval combined." And Eleanor had lifted her chin and met the curious stares with quiet dignity, not performing or pretending to be someone she was not, but simply existing fully in her own skin. And she had seen something shift in some of the faces, a grudging respect for a woman who refused to apologize for her existence. She had written to Vivienne 3 times since the wedding, careful letters that extended connection without demanding response. For she understood that her sister's golden cage was in some ways more difficult to escape than Eleanor's invisibility had been. And when the 3rd letter finally received a reply, Eleanor had opened it with trembling hands to find a brief note that said only, "I am glad you are happy. I think perhaps I have never known what happiness feels like beneath performance. Your sister, Vivienne." And Eleanor had cried for the glimpse of truth beneath her sister's perfect facade, and had written back immediately with an invitation to visit Silverton whenever Vivienne wished for respite from relentless social performance their father demanded. The months at Silverton taught Eleanor that transformation was not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small daily choices to claim space, to speak truth, to trust that her presence mattered, and there were still days when the old voices whispered that she was unremarkable and forgettable, but now she had Adrian's steady presence and her own growing self-knowledge to counter those whispers, and she was learning slowly to see herself through her own eyes rather than through the distorted mirror of her family's neglect. And as spring deepened into the lush abundance of early summer, Eleanor stood at her chamber window, looking out over gardens she had helped create, and felt something she had never experienced before, the simple, uncomplicated peace of belonging to her own life. The invitation had arrived at Ashford Manor in late spring with the Duke of Silverton's formal seal, a request for the Ashford family to receive the Duke and Duchess for a brief visit, and Eleanor had watched Adrian compose the letter with careful diplomatic language that made clear this was a social courtesy extended by their position rather than any personal eagerness on her part, for she had told him honestly that returning to that house filled her with complicated emotions she could not entirely untangle. But Adrian had taken her hand and said gently, "You need not go if the prospect causes you pain. But sometimes closure requires us to return to places we have left so that we can see how far we have traveled." And Eleanor had recognized the wisdom in his words, even as her stomach tightened with apprehension at the thought of walking through those familiar rooms as a different person entirely. When their carriage rolled up the drive on a bright June morning, Eleanor felt as though she were watching the scene from a great distance, observing the woman she had been rather than inhabiting her, and for everything looked simultaneously exactly the same and utterly transformed by her own transformation. And when her father emerged to greet them, his smile was strained and his bow slightly too deep, the discomfort of a man forced by social convention to welcome a daughter he had dismissed, now that she carried a title that outranked his own. And Eleanor felt a peculiar mixture of vindication and sadness, for she had not wanted revenge but simply recognition, and even now he could not see her but only her position. The formal reception in the drawing-room was an exercise in careful politeness, her father deferential to Adrian, while addressing Eleanor with the sort of distant courtesy one might show to any visiting duchess, and Vivienne sat perfectly composed in a gown of pale blue that set off her beauty, but seemed somehow dimmer than Eleanor remembered, as though the luster had faded, or perhaps Eleanor's eyes had simply learned to see different kinds of beauty. And when Adrian guided the conversation with diplomatic skill, Eleanor watched her family perform their roles and felt profoundly grateful that she no longer had to perform her own erasure to maintain their comfort. The turning point came when Vivienne requested a private word with Eleanor in the conservatory, and Eleanor followed her sister into the glass-enclosed space filled with her mother's plants that someone had continued to tend in the years since Eleanor's departure. And Vivienne turned to face her with an expression that held none of her usual perfect composure, but instead something raw and honest, and she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, Eleanor, for I have spent these months watching you from a distance through social gossip and reports, and I have seen you become everything I pretended to be: admired, valued, genuinely happy, and I have had to confront the truth that my golden cage is still a cage, that being seen only for beauty and accomplishment is its own kind of invisibility, for no one sees the person beneath the performance." And Eleanor felt her heart crack open with compassion for the sister who had seemed to have everything, and she reached for Vivienne's hands and said with complete sincerity, "We both deserve to be seen wholly, Vivienne, and I am sorry that Father's limited vision trapped us both in roles that diminished us. And I want you to know that if you ever wish to step out of that cage, if you ever want to discover who you are beneath what others expect, my home is open to you." And Vivienne's eyes filled with tears that she did not immediately brush away, and in that moment Eleanor saw her sister truly for perhaps the first time, and recognized that they had both been casualties of the same narrow definition of value. Before they departed, Eleanor asked Adrian if she might visit her mother's grave alone, and he understood without explanation and waited at the carriage, while Eleanor walked through the churchyard to the stone marker she had not seen since her wedding day, and she knelt in the grass and spoke aloud, as if her mother could hear, telling her about Silverton and the gardens and the poetry and the love she had found. And she said, "You told me once that roses bloom in their own time, that forcing growth only damages what is trying to become, and I understand now that my decade of invisibility was not wasted time but preparation, the dormancy before blooming, and I hope wherever you are, you can see that your daughter has finally come into her own season." And she placed a cutting from the Silverton roses on the grave as a symbol of continuity and transformation, and when she rose and walked back to where Adrian waited, she felt a sense of completion, not because she had been vindicated before her family, but because she had returned to her beginning transformed, and that transformation was proof enough of her journey's worth. 3 years had passed since Eleanor had left Ashford Manor as the Duke of Silverton's bride. 3 years that had transformed not only her life, but her very understanding of what a life could contain, and on a golden afternoon, in late summer, She stood at the edge of the gardens she had created at Silverton and felt the profound contentment of a woman who had finally grown into the fullness of her own existence, for these gardens were nothing like her mother's careful English roses, but rather a wild profusion of color and texture that reflected Eleanor's own discovery, that beauty need not be constrained by others' expectations, but could bloom in whatever form brought joy to the gardener. The estate had become truly hers in ways that went beyond legal ownership, for she had left her mark on every aspect of its operation. From the modernized tenant cottages to the library she had expanded, to include a reading room where estate workers' children could borrow books, and the staff no longer treated her with the careful deference reserved for an uncertain newcomer, but rather with the genuine affection earned by a mistress who knew their names and their families and their dreams. And Mrs. Blackwood had told her just last week with tears in her eyes that Silverton had not felt so much like a home since Adrian's mother had lived. And Eleanor had embraced the older woman with gratitude for the comparison that honored both duchesses without suggesting one was merely replacing the other. Her poetry had been published under her own name now, a slender volume titled The Invisible Hours that had received surprisingly warm reception in London's literary circles, and though some society matrons had sniffed that a duchess ought not to expose her inner life so publicly, Eleanor had found that she cared far less about such judgments than she once would have imagined possible, for she had learned that living authentically meant accepting that some people would never understand or approve, and their incomprehension said more about the limits of their vision than about the value of her truth. But the greatest transformation, the one that brought Eleanor to tears in quiet moments when she paused to recognize the magnitude of change, was the small figure currently kneeling in the garden beds, with dirt-smudged cheeks and wild dark curls escaping from her braids. For Charlotte Rose Rothwell, at 3 years old, was everything Eleanor had never been allowed to be: exuberant, confident, secure in the knowledge that her parents delighted in her existence. And Eleanor watched her daughter dig enthusiastically in the soil, searching for worms, and felt a fierce determination that this child would never know what it meant to make herself small or to doubt her worthiness of love and attention. Adrian emerged from the house, carrying Charlotte's forgotten sun hat, and crossed the lawn with the easy grace that still made Eleanor's heart quicken even after years of marriage, and he paused beside her to watch their daughter's industrious excavation before saying quietly, "She has your passion for growing things, though perhaps not yet your patience with the actual plants." And Eleanor laughed and leaned into his shoulder as Charlotte triumphantly held up a wriggling earthworm for their inspection, and Adrian called out, "Well done, little gardener. Shall we find him a new home?" and went to kneel beside their daughter with complete disregard for his expensive trousers, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with gratitude for this man who had seen her when she was invisible, and who now saw their daughter with the same generous, attentive vision. That evening, after Charlotte had been tucked into bed with stories about magical gardens and brave forgotten princesses who discovered their own power, Eleanor and Adrian sat together in the library with the windows open to the summer twilight and the scent of roses drifting in on the warm breeze. And he was reading correspondence while she worked on new poems, but they were connected by the comfortable silence of two people who need not perform or explain themselves. And when Adrian set aside his letters and came to kneel beside her chair and take her hands in his, she saw in his eyes the same wonder and recognition that had passed between them that first evening when he had retrieved her dropped napkin, and he said, "Do you remember when you told me you had been a ghost at Ashford? Sometimes I still cannot believe my extraordinary fortune in being the one who saw you, in being granted the privilege of watching you become fully yourself." And Eleanor cupped his face in her hands and kissed him with the tender assurance of a woman who had finally learned to trust that she was seen and valued and loved, not despite her ordinariness, but because of the extraordinary depth and beauty that ordinariness contained. And she whispered against his lips, "I was a seed in darkness waiting for the proper season, and you gave me the light and space to bloom, but the blooming itself that I had to choose." And Adrian smiled and said, "And thank God you chose it. Thank God you chose yourself. Thank God you chose me." And they sat together as the summer darkness deepened around them, and Eleanor thought about the girl she had been, invisible and forgotten, and felt only tenderness for that younger self who had survived by becoming small, for that survival had made possible this thriving, and she had learned that transformation was not betrayal of who we were, but rather the fullest expression of who we had always been, beneath the layers of protection and performance, waiting for our season to finally arrive.